Princess Camaldry Tassu, Duchess of Chivray, glanced over the gardens of the Northern Palace, idly watching, as a pair of gardeners went about their tasks in the planting beds, cutting back around the corylus ferns. It was a shame the fall fete would have to be cancelled when the corylus looked to be doing so splendidly. In a few days, the ferns would react to the dropping temperatures and burst into a vibrant symphony of colour that would look stunning as one strolled about the grounds. But now, her sister, Calandry, was dead, and the universe had changed. She'd need to meet with Mother. That was a suitable beginning while the Empress was in mourning, as much as Mother ever showed her feelings. Empress Kamalesh Tassu was far too much of a seasoned soldier to show anything as unseemly as grief. Not in public, at least. Over the last few years, she'd had all the warmth of an old boot. There would be a full military funeral, where she and her brother, Lural, would stand stoically behind Mother as she extolled Calandry's many virtues, her dedication to the Imperium, and the loss of her brilliant promise, before going into a period of suitable mourning. Before the funeral, there would be the traditional voyage out to reclaim her body, or from the sound of things, some meaningful piece of ash that could be passed off as remains and given dutiful reverence. She would travel with Mother, for the look of the thing. It would be so tedious. It wouldn't be fair to say that she'd hated her sister. More that Keller had always been such a Paulterian suckerfish, always swimming close and looking so harmless. Dutiful, caring, and generous. To be fair, Keller had been most of those things. That alone made her such a spine under her skin. It had also made her an irredeemable bore. As the firstborn daughter, Camaldry had taken the proper path. After graduation, she entered the interior and served with distinction in and around the capital. Naturally, the symbolism had been vital. Princess Camaldry, a devoted daughter of the Empire, pledging her life to the safety of her beloved Empress, Callista, and the security of her family. She could remember how she had been considered the eventual heir. That was after grandmother Callista declared their mother as her heir instead of Aunt Arduina. Even with the family uproar, those were exciting times. The universe seemed to lay at her feet, and she'd retired from the interior to take up her family duties almost immediately. Of course, she hadn't planned on Keller. Instead of slipping into the background, Keller joined the Imperial Marines the day after graduation. That wasn't unexpected. A princess should take a responsible position and show the public face of the family. What she hadn't expected was that Keller would be so good at it. When Calandry graduated from Marine Officers' Corps training with high honours, Mother had been tickled purple. Looking back, it should have been the first warning sign. Rather than taking a post on Shill, Keller had asked to be posted with the 43rd Exo Raiding Group, where she not only excelled but started building a public persona in a series of anti-piracy actions across the Inner March. Mother had beamed with pride, and Camaldry hadn't missed that. Really, it could be considered a cautionary tale. Mother never cared for the interior, but no matter what she did to ensure Mother's happiness, it was never enough. She had worked diligently to support her mother after grandmother's death, but report some landing action on some insignificant dirtball and she was all smiles. When Mother designated Calandry as heir, she hadn't even been surprised. She stood at the ceremony with her brother, Lural, on one side, and her infant sister, Calira, on her right, in the arms of a governess. She put on a mask of suitable propriety at all the appropriate moments. She'd never forget how her aunt sat stoically in the first row. The woman never really recovered from her loss of position. A lack of grace would be an understatement of nothing less than magnificent proportions. Every moment on the dais beside Lural and listening to Calira fuss had burned the lesson into her. She had supported her mother and the Empire in all things, and she would make her public facade the reality. Her aunt had made a spectacle of herself on too many occasions. Certainly it prompted grandmother to pass her over as heir. There were stories, but if her actions before being passed over were seldom discussed, her subsequent behaviour made her the family pariah, seldom seen except to be trotted out at the most important functions. If her sister was now the heir, she would accept the matter with sublime grace, and fulfil her role when called upon. Unlike her aunt, she would not be relegated to living in the shadows of public life. Of course, there were benefits. She'd always adored the more traditional aspects of family, and revelled in living a civilized life. The capital was the heart of the empire, which made it the heart of the galaxy. What could possibly compare? The consortium had its capital around and under the great crystal cavern, held sacred by the Night Crew. What was that except a sparkly hole in the ground, after all? And the Alliance? There were serious doubts they had a capital at all, so much as a running internal argument. The entire Alliance had less culture than a yeast vat of blue grail. If her life had to devolve into a meaningless routine of public and charitable service, attending dinners or sitting visibly at the occasional fundraising event, so be it. She would not be sidelined as a non-serving member of the family. It wasn't a bad life either. The majority of her time was her own, where she could cherish her privacy while honouring traditional values. While the Southern Palace wasn't the capital, it was never lacking for all manner of wicked delights and plentiful diversions. It was all out of the public eye as well. Aunt Ardwina's example had brought home the value of discretion, if only by her utter lack of it. But now, the universe had smiled. Calandri was dead, burned to atoms in the back of the galactic beyond. Lorau had been married for years and was doing his bit as the proud husband of Trinia de Seren, off raising a brood of mewling nieces. House de Seren was politically useful, and another emperor was never going to be in the cards. That left only little Kalira, who'd been destined to be married off like Lorau. The poor dear wasn't even out in public yet. Hidden away before being presented as an adult. She wouldn't even be underfoot during the ceremonial voyage to collect her dead sister's freeze-dried cremains, if there were any. Setting down her omnipad, she waved across the terrace to Sanvri. As a secretary, he was ever so useful, and so pretty, and she had to banish a smile as he hurried over. Sanvri, something absolutely terrible has happened. Contact the palace at once to set a meeting with the Empress. Cancel all of our appointments for the next few weeks, with our deepest regrets for the full fate, and summon our head of security. Something terrible, Your Royal Highness? Sanvri looked at her, taken aback. Yes, Sanvri. A dark storm for our family and the Empire. She watched him take down her instructions. He was such a tasty little morsel. She might reward herself with him when she got back, but now was no time for distractions. It was so hard to look somber, yet one did what one must. Be about it. Time is of the essence, and we need to compose ourselves. She turned then, looking grandly across the courtyard as Sanvi withdrew. It was such a lovely day. She drew the crisp fall breeze into her lungs and looked out to where the gardeners laboured to ready the grounds for a party that sadly would never come to pass. She did so feel like celebrating. It was a lovely full day, and as Ganya looked out the window of her office, she smiled to herself. It was a little luxury, before going home to Nedrin and Birholm. It was always a relief at the end of the day to share a drink with Nee before dinner. Birholm was a gifted cook, and she loved bringing home something for them all to laugh about. There wasn't a day she wasn't grateful for her family. Shell had, thankfully, gone better than expected. They curled up in bed to watch Meet the Empire, fearing for the worst, and sharing her relief that nothing awful had happened. Just as well. Now that he knew Miv had a co-wife and a suitor, Birhom had been pestering her to invite them all for dinner. And it had only grown worse after she mentioned Warwick went out into town to cook. At least she could issue an invitation now. The interview had prompted calls from so many news agencies that Ilala had called her office 5 times before noon. Every semester it was a small miracle the woman survived registration. Ganya mulled things over. Nia and Bihom were interested to meet the trio. They always enjoyed having Miver over. The morning call with the legal had been reassuring. Their universal opinion was that the interview that was Professor Warwick had maintained the professional integrity of the Academy and steered free from subtext that could be considered actionable. Ganya sniffed in amusement. Far be it from any of those women to say if they'd actually liked it. The controversy wasn't a problem, as long as the matter could be properly managed. The Academy wanted to maintain its image as a progressive institution on the leading edge of education, so a bit of exposure now and then was all to the good. Not that Elia was entirely wrong. There had been word of reporters encamping at the Academy gates for a few hours. A quick call to legal had quickly dispelled them, though there were reports that at least one individual continued to lurk about, just off the grounds. That was a nuisance. She'd have to text Warwick before the end of the day, and tell him to stay hidden when he left the campus. Ganya's smile returned as she looked at the note from Tananda Bagress. Apparently the aging professor had a wonderful trip for the birth of her grandson, and was now planning to retire at the end of the school year. Given the vibrant and energetic class, she'd wholly recommended Warwick take on the seminar after her departure. It brought a warm feeling that made Ganya think of those 4 little words that meant so much. Better him than me. That just left one final matter. The invitation to the Ministry of Education's fall conference. Normally, it was an afternoon conference followed by an evening affair, and truthfully, she'd been looking forward to rubbing Vermi Rasani's tusks in it for most of this past semester. Ganya shared a competitive streak with the head administrator of Sochi Pan Technical, and stealing a march on her peers was just what she needed in the week before fall quarterly exam week, the student show, and a blessed week of actual vacation. Of course, that was before the invitation arrived with an attached note from the minister. She was looking forward to meeting Tom Warwick that evening. Ah well, you've dealt with worse. She'd reached out to Warwick in the morning. It was far too nice an afternoon to spoil. Oh, my dearest Kardera. Kardera Zariva, Special Agent of the Interior in charge of security for Princess Kamordri Tasu, gave a shallow bow at her patron's greeting. The princess was in one of her moods, if her pronounced use of traditional flowery speech was anything to go by, which meant a wise woman would tread carefully until she knew more. You're so blissfully free from the ravages of morality. I can't tell you what a blessing you are on particular days like today. You have some news that makes it a particular day, Your Royal Highness? Kardera studied her patron's face. There was a hint of barely expressed glee that Kamordri seemed to reserve for planning the fate she loved when surrounded by at least 3 suitors, or the fawning attention of courtiers cultivated outside of the public eye. I do have news, my dearest Kardera. Kaishra arched an eyebrow, the smile definitely tugging at the corner of her mouth. It's going to be one of those kind of days. Kamordri was a fickle woman who took on affections of courtly mannerisms in the inexplicable belief they were traditional. For the most part, that manifested in her wearing push-up vests, though in conversation it usually took the form of courtly speech that was centuries out of date. If she was starting with, my dearest Kardera, then something had her fancy, and the best thing to do was simply play into the game. "News, Your Royal Highness." Cardera arched her brows in innocent surprise as her style of speech changed to match her patron's. "Will you share it with me, then?" "I nearly think I shall." Camaldry brushed a hand over Cardera's shoulder lightly. "Well, I await nothing better." Cardera canted her head slightly, the very image of patient curiosity. "And you would be right to do so," she replied primly, with a genteel nod of her royal approval. "I am always pleased to wait upon Your Royal Highness." "And you are patience itself, which has never gone unrewarded." That was more subtle than usual, but it had the virtue of being honest. Cardera had met Camaldry during their first year serving the interior, and each had seen just what they needed in the other. "Here is the news, then. My sister, Calandry, is dead." "Dead, Your Highness? How?" Cardera didn't have to hide her feelings then. The surprise was genuine enough. "Indeed." Camaldry peered down her nose at her before looking back to the gardens. "I have said it." "And so I must believe it, though it is shocking." Cardera knew Camaldry's ways, and some days the woman could be as variable as a toy boat in a typhoon. But with news like this, were it from anyone else, I could scarce not credit the idea. "And now?" the princess asked archly. "Well, but from your lips it must be so," she said earnestly, as her thoughts passed quickly over the scope of the repercussions. "Will you voyage with the Empress to gather her remains?" "How can I not? It is an honoured tradition, and so good for the people to see." Camaldry kept looking over the gardens, as if striking a pose for posterity, but glanced over at her from the corner of her eye, and her voice was all smiles again. "It only leaves me with one trifling concern." "Pray, what concern? You perceive that your concerns are mine." "That is both good and dutiful of you." Camaldry touched her hand to her heart and nodded, as if the consolation were her greatest comfort. "Well, but with my person." "How? Your person, you say?" Cardera canted her head even more, indicating a greater degree of curiosity. Now, at least, the woman would get on with it. "I nearly think I do." The princess looked out over the empty garden as if she were reviewing a parade. "Shall I tell you of it?" "By the deeps, as your head of security, I am certain I would like nothing better," she said, with some gentle emphasis. She'd gotten over wanting to throttle the woman years ago. "I am thinking of the future, my dearest Cardera," she replied piously. "The future of the Empire, and my family. With the death of Calandry, I think I must soon be designated as heir. It is a difficult thing to contemplate, as there will be the funeral and a time of mourning, and yet—" "And yet, Your Royal Highness." "Yes, my dearest Cardera, and yet." "And this yet bothers you?" "I nearly think it must. While I am away with Her Imperial Majesty, there is still the issue of my youngest sister, Calera." "Issue, Your Royal Highness." Cardera gave the word the gravity she knew her patron wanted, even as she made certain to use her formal title with sincerity. Presentation was everything with Camaldry, and the woman adored being fawned over. "Yes, I do so enjoy the thought of being Empress. As you will perceive, I once held it in my hands, and now may do so again." Camaldry deigned to turn and face her, then. "I trust you will ensure all steps are taken to ensure it comes to pass." There it was, then. Patience was so often underestimated as a virtue. "I must perceive it, as you state the matter so clearly," she said, and bowed her head again, acknowledging the matter. "Oh, Cardera, you flatter me so." Her Royal Highness bestowed a convivial smile. "Never in life would I indulge in false flattery." Cardera took a half step back and carefully bowed her head once more. It was perfectly ridiculous, but the princess always loved it. It is no more than the truth, Your Royal Highness.
Then I trust you to take care of matters in the ways I know you are best able.
The princess took a deep breath and finally got to the point.
I do so like the sound of Your Imperial Majesty. You know you have never found us ungrateful.
So, there's the bait. For all her eccentricities, Camordre always made good, and Kadira nodded. I shall set matters into motion, Your Royal Highness. Well, maybe it was a good day to celebrate after all. What do you think they're talking about, Captain? Sergeant Yalla looked up at the board, zoomed in from the nearest security feed, and they could just see the side of Objective as she sat at the base of a tree, and Sergeant Orena from Pod 2 was moving into range in her cover as one of the groundskeepers. On a day like today, Goddess Yalla, Captain Priyan Biona rubbed her forehead. The death of the princess, and the defeat was the greatest blow to the Imperial fleet since the war. The largest peacetime loss in decades. It doesn't take much to guess. At least Warwick is out there with her. He's a nice male. I mean, he's a human, but better than just sitting there alone. Yala grimaced as she tried to get more focus. The camera had a slightly better view of the professor, but the canopy of leaves still obscured most of the objective. I don't know why we still have him listed as a target. You know he's going to say something nice, or try. He's still an unknown, and we're tasked with protecting that girl, she said, as she ran a check on the rest of Pod 2. Pod 1 was undercover as part of the janitorial staff, but at least they were on call. Until and unless the agent changes things, he stays on the target list. You never know what life is going to hand you. Things were going well between Jacksme and the Tharios, and while it made Deshin happy for all of them, that left her with a problem. She was homeless. If she'd known, she wouldn't have brought Jacksme out to the shop. Maybe. The Thario family would have taken her in for the summer, probably. Now, with them doing business with Jacksme, there was no way she could hide there for the entire summer break without Jacksme coming by. By putting good fortune their way, she cut off her only escape, before she knew that she needed one. Even more pressing was the coming fall break. It wasn't only a week, but girls with family on Shill would head home. With nowhere to go, it wouldn't look good. Not unless Professor Warwick could help. It would be humiliating to explain, but if she could convince him to put together some special task with the library collection, or English training, something to keep her on campus. She didn't even know what his plans were for the week, but he probably had something. It was all too humiliating. She'd spent the morning screwing up her courage, and since this was an off day for the library, she found herself wandering towards his office. If he was there, or maybe Professor Palavon? It was her only hope as she rounded the corner into their office. Hi, Desi. Belda looked up in surprise from where she was poring over her Omnipad. Is Professor Warwick with you? No, it's not a day we work in the library. Desi looked around the office. There was no telltale sound of activity from the office beyond. I'm looking for him myself. Is Professor Palavon in? She isn't here. Belda shook her head and pulled her Omnipad around. I was just looking up their schedules. She's out with the Beach Fitness Club and he's... can you read this? The Chess Club. Deshin peered at the entry. I've never heard of that one. Belda canted ahead. Do you know what it is? Oh, well, chess. It's what goes on chess burgers, isn't it? Deshin hadn't a clue, but her English was coming along and the word looked close. If the phonetics were right. She warmed to her theory and brightened in spite of herself. Maybe it's something to do with his cooking. I checked the syllabus too.
Belder looked doubtful and picked at the notion. It says it's out at the biology building. That doesn't seem like a good place for a cooking class, Desi conceded, deflating slightly. I've never even been out there. Oh, my class is in agriculture there. I thought I'd go see, Belder hesitated a moment. It's a very long walk, though. You might not want to go all that way. Oh, I don't mind, Desi offered tentatively, unless you need to talk to him about something important. Oh, no. Belder shook her head. Just stuff, you know. What about you? Me? Oh, no. Nothing important, just things. The girls stared at each other in awkward silence. So, no reason we can't walk out there together? Belder said, waving at the door absently. Enthusiasm seemed to elude her. No reason at all. Deshin pulled open the door and gave a smile that narrowly avoided being a reluctant grimace by a very generous act of charity. It's just stuff. Yeah, and things. People who say there's nothing new under the sun lack imagination. Special Agent Kadira Sariva of Her Imperial Majesty's Ministry of the Interior settled into her office chair and considered the problem. What a long and unexpected voyage it's been to arrive here. She'd met Princess Camaldry their first year together in the interior, and as she often reminded herself, they had everything to offer one another. The princess was a princess. The benefits that she had to bestow were plentiful in their variety, and ready to hand, so long as they weren't bestowed too frequently or too publicly. Kadira eschewed both, which suited them equally. Rarity made Her Royal Highness look even more magnanimous. Rarity also kept Kadira from looking greedy. Not that there hadn't been the temptation. As a child, she'd held out the hope of maintaining her family. It was a vain desire, as the house of Zariva had fallen solely into the hands of her mother, Baroness Zariva. Her mother, the drunkard. Ultimately, her father had left, ending the marriage in divorce. Unfortunately, that had also been the last hand of restraint between her mother and ruin. It wasn't that she'd hoped for great wealth. The barony had been modest, but it was still a title. Her grades had always been good, and her goals had been simple. She'd aspired to restore the family business, polish the family name, and, in time, even marry well. Her mother had a bottle in her hand the minute her father closed the door behind him. Perhaps it might have been better to go with him, but she'd had such hopes. Her father had no title at all, and such were the dreams of youth, that so easily turned into the foibles of maturity. She hadn't learned how fully her mother had frittered their fortunes away, until the bank foreclosed 4 months later. At the age of 11, with all remaining assets and accounts frozen, she and her mother had found themselves on the street, encamped behind a restaurant's trash bins. Somehow, her mother still had a bottle in hand. That night, nestled beside the restaurant exhaust for heat, clutching at her ragged shirt, and laying in a space barely cleared of the worst filth, had been the worst experience of her life. Her mother was an abusive drunk, and her last words lamenting Kadira wasn't a boy, so she could sell his cock on the street. The words had come in a fit of drunken anger, just before grabbing her by the blouse and tearing it, and landing a blow that blacked one eye. One final exertion before the stupor of drink had taken her. Kadira remembered cowering nearby, falling asleep a terrified girl, hoping she could call her father and beg him to take her in. Afraid her mother wouldn't be there when she woke, and just as afraid that she would. The Kadira Sariva who awoke the next morning thanked the stars for that night, and for her mother slowly snoring nearby. The solution had been so terribly crude, looking back on it.
Thankful to still have her Omnipad, it was the work of moments to check the family insurance policy was still paid through the end of the month. The alley they'd huddled in out of shame was far too poor to have security cameras, and she could still feel the fine grain of the Cermacrete block lifted high over her head, just before she crushed her mother's skull. In hindsight, it was miraculous that the authorities hadn't bothered with a proper investigation, but her mother's blood alcohol content and the story of a brawl with another drunk had been all the evidence required. She was alone, half in rags, and she stank. The notion that she might have a substantial inheritance to collect never occurred to them. As a crime, it was criminally sloppy, and yet she could give some thanks to that dereliction of duty. Lacking any comprehensive investigation, the insurance company didn't have enough grounds to refute her claim. She was old enough to no longer be a minor if she claimed her rights as an adult, and so they'd paid. She could imagine the gritted teeth of the claim agent she had never met, but the electronic transfer of funds had been reliably prompt. 3 weeks after being cast out into the street, she was settled into a small apartment in her old school district, with clothes on her back, money in her pocket, and food on the table. She'd not even missed the start of her last school year, and she'd never, ever looked back. The only interruption to devouring her studies had been to a role in the Interior Officers Training Cadre the first day school was back in session. It had been a good move. Instead of looking forward to running a small business under the burden of her mother, she'd emerged from that alley with everything she needed in life. She had the tools, an education with reasonable grades in prior years. She focused every part of her being on earning top marks for her final year, and succeeded. She had the career, the interior, which had taken her in, had its rewards when she graduated at the top of her class. And she had the most valuable thing of all, a life affording her scope. It was all so clear, really. The Legion of the Interior was dedicated to the health of the imperial family and prosperity of the Imperium, but the tree that had grown strong enough to support an empire spanning the galaxy had gone far too long without being pruned. Mother was proof enough of that. Had she needed more evidence, many of the noble girls in her IOTC class were little more than fops, used as barnacles clinging to the top layers of society. The nobility didn't need to be wiped clean or polished. If it was going to be pure once more, it needed to be shriven. It needed to be scourged. There could be few things better than a life spent in the quiet pursuit of excellence, with a mission that afforded you scope. From the start of her career, she set out to be a bane to the worst of them. That dedication had almost made her miss her chance. Meeting Princess Kamordri Tassu, even before penetrating her cover story, had been another blessing, and after assessing the situation, Kadira had never looked back. As an imperial princess, Kamordri had so many personal obligations to take care of, and after befriending the woman, Kadira had made it her duty to ruthlessly, effectively, and above all quietly, clear away certain hazards from the pristine beach of Her Royal Highness's life. In return, the princess had proven true to her word and had not been unappreciative. For her 15th birthday, Kamordri restored her family title as Baroness. By her 20th, Kadira had obtained holdings sufficient to secure her comfort for life. Most recently, she'd been elevated to the title of Viscountess in reward for service to the throne. That wasn't enough, because you could never forget, money and titles are only tools. She'd used the tools and contacts at her disposal, and wrapped her work in the protective cloak of the princess's favour. Given the company her patron kept, finding choice targets was easy enough. There were more than enough nobles of intelligence, decency, and dedication to the empire. Kamordri found that sort of company tedious. As soon as the princess grew tired of any particular favourite, then it was Kadira's turn. If her patron proved unwilling to be rid of a particularly loathsome sycophant, a few disparaging words in the royal ear usually sufficed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the prize that Qadira wanted most. No. That would be to rise to Minister of the Interior, a position appointed solely by Her Imperial Majesty. Initially, it had seemed like a shame that she had been forced to make do with Camordri. By all accounts, the Princess Calandri had been an exemplary noble. But then, just as Qadira had reconciled herself to forever being relegated to one fish at a time, fate had turned the tide and offered her a net. Had she somehow won the favour of Calandri, instead of meeting Camordri, she'd be floating in space now, like her opposite number. Instead, back on track for the big haul, at last. Pruning the Imperial tree would be the work of a lifetime, but everything she dreamed of was now within her grasp. All that stood in the way was a young princess of indeterminate worth. Even if life occasionally had its unfortunate necessities. The future Empress Camordri would enjoy a life of all the pleasures that could be discreetly offered, while her government would be a model of efficiency. Under Qadira's hand, the interior would see to that. The interior would be cleansed first. In the fullness of time, there would be children who the Empress would be too preoccupied to raise. Qadira would see to that as well, ensuring they were given the best possible upbringing to ensure the prosperity, pride, and the future of the imperial throne and the House of Tasu. It would be irrational to believe one person could accomplish the rectification of an empire in just one lifetime, but granted the tools, she still intended to make a valiant attempt. Still, you couldn't lose focus on today by lingering on the dreams of tomorrow. As she picked out a burner connection from her omnipad and dialed, she considered the elegance of the plan and weighed the matter. It was improvised, but the princess wanted the matter accomplished before she returned to Shell. It wasn't optimal, but she would have to use the tools at hand. Sometimes haste could court disaster, but inaction would never lead you to victory. It wouldn't be murder to remove the greatest menace to society, and given her nature, it was virtually certain that Camordri would earn her death. That act would be Qadira's final work before retirement. In the end, it might even be considered a civic act. Admiral Arali Tejo sipped her drink and scowled at her omnipad in the comfort of her den. Not like there's anything else to do. While perfectly aware of the comfort of her surroundings and the security of her life, it didn't remove the gall. She had spent a lifetime constructing an image of respect in the eyes of others, and it had come to this. No one called, no invitations, no respect. A legacy of service reduced to being the butt of a joke, and a deathly fear of the dark. Her life had been wasted, all because of humanity, and that one damned human standing over her. I have everything I need, and lost everything that matters, thanks to one fucking... Her omnipad chimed. She stared at it before picking it up. No one had dialed her private number in weeks. The chime sounded again, and she looked at the code. Caller ID blocked. That wasn't done. It wasn't even legal. Except... Her heart leapt in her chest as she raced to swipe open the call. This is a command directive. The voice was clear, but the speech was altered, masked into a mechanical rumbling tone to conceal the identity of the speaker. Code Deepwater Black. Acknowledge confirmation. Acknowledged. It was one of the Deepwater codes. Only the Admiralty and above knew of their existence, and they demanded compliance. Misuse of the codes wasn't just punishable. No one sane would consider their abuse, and this was a Deepwater Black. Her throat suddenly felt dry, and she coughed to clear it. This is Admiral Arali Tejo. Confirmation. Terminus. Admiral. The Imperium has always been able to call upon me, she said assertively. Finally, people who mattered were remembering her worth. I stand ready and able to return to my duties. Have no doubts I will rise to any occasion. Admiral. No matter the difficulties in our plans, you know I've done my modest best to fight for the Imperium I love, and Admiral Tejo. There was a pause, and possibly a long sigh, though the scrambler made it difficult to tell. It's murder. The plan is murder. She paused. No call to fleet command, then, but murder. Someone was using the Deepwater codes to her, a full admiral of the Purple. Bloodshed in the course of warfare was one thing, but murder was quite another. It was out of the question. She was a soldier, not a damned assassin. Your target will be at a designated location. You will kill her and any witnesses present, one of whom will be Professor Tom Warwick, the voice said flatly, though that could have been an artifact of the Scrambler as well. You will find your reputation restored, and after the proper time has elapsed, the gratitude of the throne. On the other hand, Kadira shut down the burner call application on her Omnipad and set it aside, before walking over to the vanity table and turning on the light. You couldn't always have the tools you wanted, but despite her flaws, Arali Tejo was the right person at the right time. Certainly the mirth around her Royal Highness's court brought the Admiral to mind for some future use. Her humiliation and fall from grace must have created tremendous pressure. People under pressure could always be counted on to act. You just had to find the weakness that acted as their trigger. Everyone had a weakness. Improvisation meant coming to a situation without rigid expectations or preconceptions. But successful improvisation meant observing certain rules. Kadira removed her top, folding it meticulously to one side, before stepping out of her pants. She looked at herself for a moment after sitting down, considering the image in the mirror. Her body was trim, fit, and toned, from an hour of hard exercise every morning. It was a shame to hide herself in baggy clothes, but so be it. Reaching for the makeup remover, she studied the lines in her face before dabbing the cloth carefully over her skin. She never wore too much, and what she wore emphasized her features to make her look plain, unobtrusive. Without makeup, she had a pretty face that could have been beautiful if properly enhanced. Instead, she strove to obscure the charms nature had given her, and even gain the skills to add imperfections of no particular consequence. She had learned to be plain. One rule was never to try and outshine one's mistress and patron. As you execute your work, always make those above you feel superior and comfortable. She pondered the plan before her. It was sound, and she revelled in the extemporaneous nature of it. Of course, the tool at her disposal was far from perfect, but the time constraints placed upon her by the princess were what they were. Even so, you couldn't expect everything you planned to just fall in your lap. Rising from the vanity, she walked into her living room. The south wing of the Southern Palace had wonderful apartments, but without the warmth of the sun they were seldom chosen, and the upper floor had only 2 other occupants when Kadira moved in. A week later, she had the wing to herself. You couldn't expect everything to work out exactly as you plan it. Turning off the main light in the living room, she walked to the shelves that lined one wall, examining the memento case for a moment. There were pictures of every undeserving noble she'd removed, and the image of Countess Riefra still brought a smile to her face. Reaching under the edge of the shelf, she released the catch. That was another fine thing about being on your own. With clearance at her level, it had been relatively simple to make a minor alteration for the building plans in the palace server. Her living room was regrettably curtailed from 35 by 30 to a mere 25 by 30. Such were the privations of a public servant. This was not going to be any ordinary removal, however, and sliding the shelf back on its hinge, she stepped inside and closed the hidden door behind her. Life. It could just be full of surprises. You never really knew what lay around the next corner. The desk within the safe room was the twin of the one in the living room. The computer melded into it, powerful, sleek, and unconnected to any outside line. Connecting her Omnipad, Cardera downloaded the files she acquired, scrubbed them from the pad, then pulled open the first of them. But if you give of yourself fully and do the best you can, then you could sleep with a clear conscience. She looked in the most recent picture on file for Princess Kalira. She did take after her mother, though without the lean figure of an Imperial Marine and a lifetime of hard training. Taking a moment, she swiped to the files again, opening the folder on Special Agent Lamana Duvari. She had an exemplary record, first in her class as well, but no sign that she had ever stepped outside the lines. Capable then, even intelligent. The sort of agent that Kadira always loved to work with. But Duvari lacked vision. What you don't win today, you can still win tomorrow. Just never lose sight of your goals. Staring at the face of her opposite number, she idly flipped through the details regarding the young princess's security arrangements. She made a note on the screen, reminding herself to prompt Camaldry to volubly mention the need to protect her brother and youngest sibling while she was away. Nothing too much, just something for the record. Because some people are worth expending that little extra time and effort. Rising from the desk, she left the pictures of the princess and her keeper staring out at her from the screen. Because in the end, if you work hard enough and you always do your best... She padded to the back of the room and lay down in the corner just beside the heating vent. Laying down, all but naked upon the cold, Sermacrete pad beneath her feet, she shoved away a few bits of filthy packaging and huddled by the trash bin for warmth. The light from the monitor played over the restaurant's logo, and she brushed away a cleaner spot on the floor before laying down on her side and curling into a ball. Looking at the faces on the screen, she felt her eyes grow heavy. You could sleep knowing you'd made the universe a better place.